Ever heard of a special place in the Sahara Desert called the Richat Structure? Some call it the Eye of the Sahara because it looks like a big eye from above. What's even more shocking about this place is that it's like a puzzle piece that matches with Atlantis, the lost city that Plato talked about. But there's more to this structure than meets the eye, and scientists are only just still scratching its surface, going by recent discoveries around it. What mysteries remain hidden within this ancient structure? Join us as we explore how scientists discovered an ancient structure, hidden in the desert that defies all logic. The Eye of the Sahara. The Eye of the Sahara is an astounding thing in the desert that looks like it's from a science fiction movie. It's this huge circular shape that stretches out over 40 kilometers across the Sahara Desert. It's so big that astronauts can see it from space. But what's even more interesting than its size is how elaborate and detailed it is. It's made up of lots of circles, kind of like fingerprints, and each one is different in size, material, and how it's been shaped by time and the weather. It's like nature itself is the architect, making something exciting over millions of years. What's interesting is that most people haven't heard of it before, which is weird because it's so astonishing. Wind and water have worked together to shape this giant circle, uncovering layers that tell a story of how it's changed over time. It's a story of strength and change, showing how nature can create something beautiful through erosion. So even though it's hidden away in the desert, the Eye of the Sahara is a reminder of how incredible our planet is. The discovery of Richat Structure. In Cape Kennedy, Florida, on June 3, 1965, something really exciting happened. Two astronauts named James McDivitt and Edward White flew up into space on a big rocket called Titan II. Their spaceship, called Gemini 4, circled the Earth 62 times over 4 days. And guess what? Edward White made history by becoming the first American to walk in space. It was a huge deal. During their trip, they took lots of pictures from space, and they saw something astonishing. It looked like a giant eye staring back at them from the Earth. This eye was a big circular shape, about 30 miles wide, with rings of rock and sand around it. They named it the Eye of the Sahara because it looks like a giant eye. Even today, more than 50 years later, people are still fascinated by this strange formation. Locals call it the Guelb Erisha, or the Richat Structure. It's in the middle of the Sahara Desert in northwest Africa. Scientists think it might be something volcanic, but they're not completely sure. What's interesting about it is the way it looks. It's made up of circles within circles, like a target or a bullseye, and that's super unusual. So even though we know a lot about the Eye of the Sahara, there are still a ton of questions left unanswered. It's like a big puzzle waiting to be solved by curious scientists and those who love to find out new things. The origin of Richat Structure. When we look into where the Richat Structure, also called the Eye of the Sahara, came from, we're diving into a big mystery that's been around for millions of years. At the center of this mystery is something called the uplifted dome theory, which scientists think might explain how this exciting thing formed. Picture the Earth's crust getting a gentle push from underneath, causing a bump on the surface. Over a long time, wind and water started shaping this bump. But here's the interesting part. Not all rocks are the same. Some are tough, while others are softer. So they didn't all wear away at the same speed. This special process made the Richat Structure famous circles, each layer telling a story about how tough it was and how much time passed. It's like a history book written in rock. So, by studying these circles, scientists can learn a lot about how the Earth has changed over millions of years. It's like piecing together a puzzle of our planet's past. Hold on tight, because there's a surprising twist to this tale, all thanks to Jimmy Corsetti. He wonders, could the Richat Structure be big enough to be a city, with maybe millions of people living there? Imagine a city bustling with activity day and night, filled with traders speaking different languages from all over. It's like stepping into a whole new world. Jimmy's idea is really interesting. He thinks that ancient humans might have had something to do with shaping the Richat Structure. Now, this is just a guess, but it sure adds an extra sprinkle of mystery to the story. It's like a puzzle with a missing piece, making us wonder even more about what happened all those years ago. So, imagine if the Richat Structure wasn't just a natural wonder, but also a home to ancient civilizations. It's like diving into an adventure story where anything could happen. While we may not know for sure, Jimmy's idea makes us look at the Richat Structure in a whole new light. The Sahara Desert. The Sahara is like a really tough place on our planet. The word Sahara comes from Arabic, meaning desert. It's the biggest hot desert on Earth and spreads across 11 countries. Imagine driving through this place in a car. You could faint or even die from the extremely hot air and the intense dryness. The whole desert covers an area of about 3.5 million square miles, almost all of northern Africa. Getting lost in the Sahara is quite easy, and the ground isn't very friendly for traveling. If you think of the Sahara as a part of Earth where people can't live, you're not wrong. There are lots of things here that could hurt you, like the hot air and dangerous creatures like sidewinder snakes and foxes. It's like a big, sandy puzzle that's hard to figure out and even harder to travel through, but something is fascinating about it, too. Even though it's tough, people still find ways to live here. They've learned to adapt to the extreme conditions, finding water and shelter where they can. And there's so much history here too. Ancient cities buried under the sand, stories of explorers braving the desert's difficulties. The Sahara isn't a place for anyone who's not strong. Besides the hot weather and sandy ground, there are also big sandstorms. Just like how you see rainstorms in tropical places or big snowstorms in cold areas, the Sahara gets its kind of storm. These dust storms can be super powerful, blowing away people's camps and covering them in sand and dust piles that can be hundreds of feet tall. Most of the sand dunes you see in the desert are made by these storms. Sometimes people and their things get buried in these storms, and they're lost forever, in the thick sand. But here's something interesting. Even though the Sahara might seem like just a dry, empty place, a lot is going on there. It's like a giant hidden treasure chest. Imagine all the things, like old artifacts, cars, and maybe even valuable resources that might be buried in those sand dunes. Archaeologists who study old things are curious about what they might find hidden under all that sand. Many scientists think there are lots of old things hidden under the tough Sahara landscape. They believe there could be thousands of objects, bones from people, and whole cities that got lost there. For instance, scholars have found clues in the Sahara that tell us about a really big lake that used to be there about 200,000 years ago. This lake was in the western part of the Sahara and was extremely huge, covering an area of at least 45,000 square miles. Back then, it was one of the biggest lakes in the whole world. Now, why is this lake so important? Well, experts think it was like a lifeline for old civilizations living in the Sahara. They needed water to survive, especially in such a harsh environment. This lake would have been their main source of water, helping them stay alive in a place where it's really hard to find water. And guess what? There's a lot of proof to support the idea of these old civilizations. Scientists have dug up all kinds of old things from different times in history buried in the Sahara. They've found things that belong to people who lived a long time ago, showing us how they lived and what they did. They even discovered the remains of an ancient culture called the Garante civilization. The Garante people were a smart group who lived a long time ago, from around 200 BC to 500 CE. They were good at building things and had some interesting ideas that made them stand out from other groups back then. You can still see some of the things they made if you look in the right places in the Sahara. These Garante individuals built big towns and farms that were way ahead of their time. With special tools, scientists have found remains of these towns and farms scattered all over the Sahara. One of the main places where you can see traces of their civilization is about 620 miles south of Tripoli, a big city. This area is where they first found hints of an old settlement when they took pictures from airplanes. Even though the desert sands have covered up a lot of their buildings and farms, Archaeologists have been able to dig up some exciting things. They found things like pottery, tools, and other objects that tell us about life in this ancient African kingdom. And get this, they've even found parts of old walls that are as tall as 10 feet. These walls were used to protect their forts and fields. All these old structures are close together in a small area, which tells us that they were all part of the same group or kingdom. Meanwhile, the Sahara Desert is the vast, dry home of the Richat Structure. This desert has been shaped a lot by strong winds blowing sand around. But did you know that the Sahara wasn't always a desert? It used to be green, like a huge garden, until about 500 to 5,000 years ago. Over millions of years, the Sahara has gone through a lot of changes in weather, like a roller coaster ride. Each change left its mark on how the land wore away. At the Richat Structure, you can find really old rocks that tell us about the Earth's early days. Some of these rocks are over 600 million years old. They give us a peek into what the world was like a long, long time ago when the continents were moving around and life was just starting. But making the Richat Structure wasn't something that happened quickly. It took a long time, like a long race for the Earth. Lots of things happened, like big pieces of the Earth's crust moving and changes in the climate. All of these things together made the structure look like it does today. Erosion acted like a slow artist, carefully uncovering the layers of rock underneath. One of the most exciting things about the Richat Structure is its almost perfect circle shape. It's so unique that astronauts up in space use it as a marker. Even if you went all the way to Mauritania, you could spot it from space. Just like astronauts didn't even know about it until the Gemini missions in the 1960s. It's like a special sign in the middle of the big Sahara Desert. Looking at the Richat Structure from up high, it's like staring at a captivating painting. The circle shape stands out among all the sand and rocks. Atlantis, according to Plato. Plato told stories about Atlantis in his books called Timaeus and Critias. These stories were written a long time ago, around 300 BC, when Athens was having its best time with scholars and exciting art. Plato wasn't just a regular thinker, he was a master of big ideas about societies, what's right and wrong, and what's incredibly real. He used these stories to talk about all kinds of interesting thoughts and different ways of seeing things. And then there's Atlantis, a city on an island that Plato said was real a long time ago, way past the Pillars of Hercules, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato said Atlantis was incredibly big, even bigger than Libya and Asia combined. He described it as having rings of land and sea around it, like a target. Building something like that would have been extremely hard, with canals and bridges everywhere. But the puzzle of Atlantis goes beyond just where it might have been. Plato said Atlantis was a city with lots of interesting things and incredible technology. They had different metals like orichalcum, gold, and silver. Their city was way ahead of its time, with fancy water systems, grand temples, beautiful palaces, and busy docks. But Atlantis wasn't just about its buildings and gadgets. Plato thought it had lots of rules, traditions, and ways of doing things, all backed up by a strong army. However, as the story goes on, Atlantis changes from being a perfect example to a warning about what happens when people get greedy. It's like a big lesson about how power can be dangerous. This story is full of little details and hidden meanings that keep people interested. It's a reminder of how scholarly Plato was, and how his stories still matter today. Even though the story of Atlantis sounds like Plato's tale, there's a twist about where it was supposed to be. Some think it's the Richat Structure in the middle of the Sahara Desert, far away from the ocean. It's like a big puzzle that we're still trying to solve, and it just adds to the confusion and excitement of the whole Atlantis story. Could Richat Structure be the city of Atlantis? To confirm that the Richat Structure is truly Atlantis, we need more solid proof from the area. But there are challenges. Political issues and the location itself make it hard to explore. Graham Hancock, who knows a lot about ancient civilizations, thinks we might have found Atlantis and its lost technology. He suggests that a big disaster 12,800 years ago could have wiped out this civilization. Hancock believes this disaster happened when a comet hit the Earth, causing huge floods that nearly destroyed everything. He thinks some people survived and spread out across the world, sharing what they knew and inventing new things. Hancock and others think the Eye of the Desert could be Atlantis because of its circular shape. Plato, an ancient writer, described Atlantis as having circles, and the Richat structure looks a bit like that. Some people, called skeptics and scholars, think that what Plato wrote about Atlantis was just made-up stories. But they still think the circles in the Richat structure might have been made by people. Other experts believe in the Atlantis story but think the Richat structure is natural. They think the Atlanteans didn't make the circles, but built on them and made canals and water bodies. So far, nobody has found any canals in the Richat structure. Experts aren't sure if they got covered up by the desert sand or if they were even there in the first place. These ideas need to be checked out to see if they're true. We would need to find things like old objects or buildings in the desert that match what Plato wrote about. So far, experts have measured the Eye of the Sahara and found it's 28 miles wide. Plato said Atlantis was 42 miles wide, so there's a bit of a difference. This tells us that while the Richat structure is big, it's not quite as big as Plato described. Figuring out the truth about Atlantis and the Richat structure is like solving a big mystery. Even though the size difference might seem a bit strange, we need to think about how the Richat structure has changed over a long time. Scientists think that millions of years ago, the Sahara Desert used to be green and full of life, with rivers and grasslands all over, but they're not sure if there was ever a huge city like Atlantis here. People are still looking for old things from that time in the Richat structure, but they've mostly found tools used by early humans. Some of these tools are incredibly old, dating back 1.7 million years. The artifacts that archaeologists have found are mostly around the outer parts of the Richat structure. There aren't as many things in the middle, but this is based on just a few experts exploring the area. As we mentioned before, exploring the Sahara Desert is extremely hard, so we haven't looked everywhere yet. It's like a big adventure story, with scientists as the heroes, trying to uncover the secrets of the past. The Sahara Desert is like a giant treasure chest, waiting for someone to open it up and see what's inside. And who knows, maybe one day we'll find the key to unlocking all its puzzles. There's a little detail that many people don't know about Atlantis. They often picture it as being at the bottom of the ocean, but that's not exactly how Plato described it. When people look at the Sahara Desert today, they don't realize it was incredibly different in the past. Some experts think maybe the Sahara used to have more water or be more friendly for living than it is now. The Eye of the Sahara isn't just a rock formation, it's also a place full of old things that tell us about ancient people's lives. There are stone tools all around, like arrowheads, scrapers, and axes, showing us how they hunted and made things. Pieces of pottery give us clues about how they lived day to day. This shows a big step forward in how they lived and what they could do. But what's interesting are the signs of old towns or villages. It makes us wonder if people didn't just pass through here, but lived here for a long time. It's like finding pieces of a puzzle that tell us about the past. The ancient drawings and carvings on the cliffs and inside caves near the Richat structure are truly exciting. These artworks show animals like antelopes and elephants, taking us back to a time when the Sahara Desert was full of life. There are also pictures of people and strange shapes that give us hints about how these old people lived and what they believed in. These drawings and carvings aren't just interesting things from the past. They're like pieces of a puzzle that help us understand more about how humans lived in the Sahara a long time ago. They tell us stories of how people changed and adapted when the climate turned the lush land into a big desert. It's like reading a book about the past, where each picture gives us a clue about what happened. Scientists are still trying to figure out if people lived near the Richat structure for a long time or if they just stopped by. Finding signs of permanent homes would be like discovering a whole new chapter in the story of Africa's past. It helps us learn even more about how early human societies lived and grew on this huge and diverse continent. Graham Hancock says, the Sahara Desert is one of the top 3 places on Earth that we haven't explored much. The other 2 are the Amazon rainforest and the deep parts of the ocean. These places could have lots of old things buried under the ground, but it's been hard for scientists to check because it's so tricky to get there and it can be dangerous. However, now we have new and better tools that can help us explore without even having to go there. Things like drones and satellites can take pictures and collect information from far away. This helps us learn about places like the Richat Structure without having to travel there ourselves. But if we want to find something big, like an old city or important artifacts, we might still need to dig into the ground. Did you know that about 1/4 of all the sand dunes in the world are in the Sahara Desert? These dunes have been covering up old cities and even the bones of people and animals for a long time. Atlantis, the legendary lost city, could be hiding under all that sand, along with many other secrets. Another place people think could be Atlantis is the Bimini Road, which is underwater. The Bimini Road is like an underwater path made of rocks that looks kind of like a man-made road with big stones on each side. It's found near the coast of an island called North Bimini in the Bahamas. Some people think this road could be the path to Atlantis, the legendary lost city. The road is only about 18 feet below the water, and there are carved limestone blocks on both sides. These blocks are all different shapes, and experts think they've been worn down over time, making them look a bit strange. Even though the Bimini Road is underwater, it's still really fascinating because no other road like it has been found anywhere else in the world. People wonder if this road could really lead to Atlantis, but right now, nobody knows for sure. It's like a big mystery waiting to be solved. Solving the mystery of Atlantis would be much easier if more experts believed in it from the start. However, many archaeologists and researchers think that Atlantis is just a made-up story by a writer named Plato. They think it's like a fairy tale, so they don't see the point in looking for it. That's why there are lots of different ideas about where Atlantis might be. Graham Hancock is one of the few experts who takes the Atlantis story seriously. He thinks there's something to it, and he's not alone. Another expert named Jimmy Corsetti has found some interesting clues that suggest Atlantis could be buried under the eye of the Sahara, a place in the desert. Corsetti is an independent researcher who likes to explore ancient history and lost civilizations. Just like Hancock, Jimmy Corsetti thinks that the circles in the Richat Structure match what Plato described well. Corsetti believes that the small difference of 14 miles is because the rocks got worn down by weather over many, many years. Another thing Corsetti talked about is a river to the south of Atlantis. As Plato mentioned, the only river close to the Sahara is the Nile, but it's not in the right place. So, Corsetti thinks there must have been a sea to the south of Atlantis when Plato wrote about it. He also says that the Sahara Desert wasn't always a desert like it is now. Corsetti says that the Sahara goes through periods of being dry and having lots of plants every 20,000 years. This happens because of how the weather patterns change over time. Corsetti thinks Atlantis was around during one of these wet periods when the Sahara was full of trees, water, and greenery. We now know from recent scientific research that the Sahara Desert used to be a lot different than it is today. Up until 5,000 years ago, it was like a tropical paradise with lots of rivers and lakes. One of the biggest lakes ever, called Mega Lake Chad, was there, and there were even signs of sea creatures like mollusks near the Richat Structure. There are also huge deposits of salt in the area, which tells us that the ocean used to be there a long time ago. Over time, the water evaporated, leaving behind salt and turning the land into the desert we see today. Research tells us that the Sahara Desert wasn't always a desert. Only about 5,000 years ago, it turned into a desert. This means that 12,000 years ago, when Atlantis was around, the Sahara was full of life. This idea helps us understand why Plato talked about lakes and lots of different animals in Atlantis. There are parts of the Sahara where scientists think there used to be big canyons and lakes. These places have special shapes and patterns that suggest water flowed through them a long time ago. It's like finding clues that tell us what the Sahara was like before it became a desert. Another thing that makes experts like Hancock and Corsetti think Atlantis is under the eye of the Sahara is the name of its first king. The first king of Atlantis was named King Atlas, and that's the same name as the king of Mauritania, where the Richat Structure is located. Plato also talked about how rich the Atlanteans were, especially in gold. And guess what? Mauritania has lots of gold. So, could the eye of the Sahara be Atlantis? And is Mauritania part of the old Atlantis kingdom? It seems like these experts might be onto something. Without strong evidence, scientists can't officially say they've found Atlantis. But if the eye of the Sahara is Atlantis, it would be a huge deal. People like Hancock, who have always thought Plato's story was true, would be super excited. We'll just have to be patient and see what new evidence shows up in the future. What happened to the ruined city of Atlantis? Even if the eye of the Sahara turns out to be Atlantis, there's still a big question. What happened to all the old buildings in the city? So far, nobody has found any signs of old buildings there. Some people think Plato's story might hold the answer. Plato talks about how Atlantis was this incredible city, but the more they had, the more they wanted. They kept wanting more and more until, according to Plato, they made the gods angry. What's intriguing is that the eye of the Sahara is about 250 miles away from the Atlantic Ocean. But if you look at it from space, you can see something really interesting. There are these big lines in the ground that look like they were made by lots of water moving around. It's like the land got all scratched up by a huge flood. So even though we haven't found the buildings yet, we can still see clues from way up in space. This shows that a really powerful force of water, much stronger than we thought possible, moved across the eye of the Sahara from east to west toward the Atlantic Ocean. This matches up with the idea that Atlantis was destroyed by a huge flood. So, if we ever find the ruins of Atlantis, they're likely to be near the Atlantic coast. If Atlantis existed and we find it one day, which could happen, we could learn a ton from it. It would change what we know about the past. The story of Atlantis and this civilization in the Sahara could even be where human civilization started in that part of the world. It's like finding a missing puzzle piece that helps us understand how everything began. What do you think about Graham Hancock and Jimmy Corsetti's research about Atlantis hidden beneath the Richat Structure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.